We have in our studio today a Turkish former Minister of Economy and an economist of world repute, Kemal Dervis. And Kemal Dervis has just published a book called A Better Globalization. And we are going to discuss some of the themes he has treated in the book, as well as the issues of great current importance. Welcome to the studio.
Thank you. Good to be here at Yale.
The first question I'd like to ask you is this issue of North Korea's declaring to have nuclear weapon. That issue brings the question of world security right to the doorstep of the United Nations. And at the United Nations at this stage seems kind of totally incapable of handling it, because Security Council is not in a position to decide anything. So how does one move the world sort of problem on security if the Security Council is kind of paralyzed because of differences that exist between the 5 permanent members?
Yeah, that's the heart of the security problem, the collective security problem. In fact, we discussed this today at the Center for Globalization at Yale. I think the Security Council is the only institution really in the international system that does have power, potential power if you like, but too many times that power is deadlocked by really the veto power of individual countries. And I think one important thesis in the book, which has a lot of support in the world, is that one has to move to a more representative Security Council, but at the same time a Security Council that works. Global democracy cannot be just one country, one vote. You cannot have China and Malta have the same weight in the international system. So one has to have weighted voting, weights that reflect the size of the country, the population, and the resources the country contributes to the international system. And so one proposal is to really move to a Security Council that is more universal with weighted voting. It's tough because the existing veto holders, of course, they have it.
Right.
They don't want to give it up. And so it's not an easy proposition at all.
But from what you are suggesting is it doesn't require the United States or China to give up the veto, does it?
Well, no, individual vetoes, I think, should, maybe not immediately, there can be transition period, but 15, 20 years from now, I think it will be very hard to justify, for example, that the United Kingdom, which is an important country, but of course compared to India or China or even Brazil, is a small country and will become smaller in time, that forever it should keep an individual veto power. Instead, I think Europe should have enough weight in the system that a weighted majority voting system would give it de facto veto power. So the United States, by its size, population, resources, could block important decisions, could in a sense have a way to stop things that it really doesn't want. But I think one has to graduate this. It's only the very, very, very important decisions that should be subject to large supermajorities, which would give these important countries blocking power. In other cases, decisions should be made more easily by simple majorities or smaller supermajorities.
Yeah,
so
like
that's what's discussed in the book.
Yeah, I think you were saying that for decision to invade a country to...
Yes, you really need a supermajority.
Supermajority, which is 4/5 of the weightage.
Right, right. That's my proposal.
Now, if you can explain a little bit, so how does the weightage work? What are the components of the weightage?
Well, the proposal I have, and of course other things are possible also, but the 4 weights that I propose are population, very important. In today's world, where we want democracy to triumph, and we say that democracy needs to be supported, it can't stop at the borders of the nation state. So population is important. You have to give countries weight according to their population. But other things also should count. GDP, the resources that country has, the part of the resources it contributes to global public goods, and also the capacity for peacekeeping in the security area. Its military capacity to enforce security should also be one of the weights. So that's what I'm proposing. And of course, whether one wants to weight this equally or give some more weight to one of these factors is open to debate.
And you said that you have support from quite a lot of people.
Well, not necessarily the ones that make the final decisions, but I do work with quite a bit of social democrats around the world, in Europe, in Latin America. There is support for this kind of system because conceptually, logically, if we believe in collective security, if we really believe in a legitimate system of global collective security, there is really no alternative to something like that. And one of the points I often make, if we had a strong system of collective security that could have prevented, for example, the war in Yugoslavia or the Iraq war by joint collective action that would have influenced events much more, we could have saved maybe 100 billion, 200 billion, 300 billion dollars. So it's so important that we get it right. In the fight against AIDS, which is very important, we try to mobilize 3, 4 more billion, 5 more billion, save hundreds of thousands, millions of people. And then when somewhere the security system breaks down, we have to spend, the world has to spend, the American taxpayer, the British taxpayer, the Turkish taxpayer, has to spend much, much more than that. So it's important, and I think citizens should realize how important it is.
So prevention costs much less than curing.
Exactly.
Yeah. So prevention, of course, when things move to a stage when you have to take military action is one. But before things reach that stage, there is a long period when the economy is collapsing, failed states are created. And how do you address that question? How does one prevent?
Yeah, that's another major message, of course, and that is that the economic, social, and environmental aspects of security are deeply interlinked with the purely military aspects of security or the physical aspects of security. Failed states, like Afghanistan was a failed state, led to tremendous catastrophes. So of course, in Africa, when governance breaks down, you've had millions of Africans die. You had it also in Europe. We always say Africa, but we should remember that the tragedy in Bosnia, was in Europe, was in the heart of Europe, so to speak. So we have to look at the economic and social aspects too, and we have to have the mechanisms by which, as you say, before it gets to the disaster point, one doesn't let the economic and social situation deteriorate to the point that then it becomes very costly to fix it. And on the economic side, one has to, of course, distinguish between different types of countries. The very poor countries are getting some help. They need more. They need also much better governance, and the two have to go together. Just throwing money at problems never works. We know that. In economics, we know that. So yes, money is needed, but it has to be used appropriately. It has to be used within a system of governance. But there are still many problems even in the middle-income countries. In my country, in Turkey, we have lots of very poor people. In Brazil, in northern Brazil, in the slums around the Brazilian cities. Of course, even in China and India, which are countries that are growing very rapidly, but inequality is a problem. Quite severe poverty still remains a problem in these countries too.
Now,
so we have to look at the poverty everywhere, not just in the poorest of the poorest countries.
Now, you are in a very unique position to address this question raised by many of the people who oppose globalization, is the heavy-handed intervention by the IMF World Bank. And you worked more than 20 years at the World Bank, and then you are back in Turkey as a Minister of Economic Affairs at a time when the economy was collapsing. 90% of GDP was going to pay for debts. Now, you turned it around with the help of IMF and World Bank. And so what would you tell the critics of IMF and World Bank? Are they right? Are they wrong?
Well, I would say, like all international organizations, they are as good to a large degree as the countries that make them up let them be. When we say the IMF does this or the IMF does that, we often have to remember that it's the big shareholders, the G7 countries, that make a lot of the really important decisions. And sometimes it's easy to blame the organization, or it's the same for the UN.
Mm-hmm.
It's very easy to say the UN doesn't do this, the UN doesn't do that. But does the UN have the means to do the things we want it to do? The same holds, I think, also quite often for the IMF and the World Bank. I think they're important institutions. They have to step in crisis moments very often, and people, obviously are in difficulties at that time. And sometimes there's a tendency sometimes to say that the difficulty is due to the IMF, which I think the difficulty was there before. However, I also strongly believe, and I felt it in Turkey, that things have to change at the IMF and at the World Bank, that these institutions have to become much more the institutions also of the developing countries. They cannot remain under this strong dominance of the G7, the richest countries.
Now, this dominance
and that change is very important for those institutions to become more effective.
Now, dominance is in terms of ideology of the institution?
In terms of ideology, in terms of governance, in terms of the boards, the way they function. Mm-hmm. That makes these institutions, which have tremendous potential to do useful things, it makes them suspect, and it makes them illegitimate in the sense of a large majority of humanity, whether it's in Turkey or in Brazil or in Argentina or in Indonesia, in India. There's no real trust.
Yeah.
And for these institutions, which have resources, which have staff, which have technical knowledge to really be useful fully and to do what they could do, I think we have to make them more legitimate.
You have, and I think an interesting example I think you have in your book, you can perhaps talk about this, is the question of farm subsidy, that Turkish farmers were being given subsidy so that they could, the economy could benefit, at the same time the poor farmers could benefit, but then IMF was opposing it, right?
Well, there was an episode where instead of having price supports, we moved to a system of income supports for poor farmers, which is a better system because the budget resources are directed towards the poorest people, and also price structures aren't distorted, and hopefully a better, more viable agriculture can come out of this. But then an IMF mission came, and because there was a hole in the budget, was looking for something to cut, and together with the government actually, they agreed to cut the direct income support to the poor farmers, which I think was a big mistake. The World Bank actually spoke up against it and said, you can't do this, you shouldn't do this. We promised the poor farmers this direct income support, and that's how we transformed the system, and we owe it to them to pay these supports. So there was a disagreement. But that disagreement, which was on substance of the policy, people immediately started to say, oh, but that's because, the bank is run by an American president who wants Turkey to be dependent on the US, and things of that sort, which had nothing to do really with the
issues. How
issues.
did it finally get resolved?
Well, they did cut, unfortunately, some of this support. But then the economy improved, and we raised hell also in the opposition. I was at that time in the opposition. And the support was reinstated a few months later. So in a sense, it got protected happily.
You have also talked about development-oriented World Trade Organization policy. If you can elaborate on that, what do you mean, and how can it be?
Well, trade is important to the world economy. It's something that potentially increases prosperity. It has worked well for, I think you're from India, for India, India has benefited from some of the trade, from some of the technologies that have come, has been growing quite rapidly lately, and China has also benefited from the global economy by exporting a lot. So it is clear that some developing countries, poor countries, can benefit from trade. But at the same time, the whole mechanism in which trade is being managed, very often powerful interests try to capture it. We saw, for example, at the end of the Uruguay round, that the powerful, rich country pharmaceutical companies introduced certain provisions about intellectual property rights that were excessive and that were really not reasonable, and in a way captured the WTO process to benefit them. So I think it's very important that this should not be allowed, that the trade expansion mechanism and that world trade should benefit everyone, and particularly the poorest people, and should not be captured by special interests backed by the rich countries. So this is one of the themes that we need to develop.
But
I'm not anti-trade. I think trade is a beneficial thing. It helps growth. It can help poverty eradication, but it must be governed like finance, like other areas, by an international governance system that is much more democratic and much more oriented towards development, and where the people from the developing countries have a much greater say.
So are you then saying that the trade-related, the intellectual property issue should not be actually raised in the WTO? Or
it should be raised, but the way it was done, and even very very free trade economists like Jagdish Bhagwati, for example, agree with this. The way it was done is to restrict access to medical products and to the production of medical products in the poor countries, and raise the cost for the poor people. And I think to a degree that is not justified. Of course, intellectual property rights have to be protected up to a certain point. One should reward people who do the research and who invent new products. But how much and how long?
Yeah.
And who should bear the cost and who should pay the cost for this? I think, should it be monopoly profits of these companies, or should it perhaps be a little bit the taxpayer that contributes to some of these costs? I think these things need to be discussed, and the way the TRIPS was introduced, I think, reflected in a way the international system at its worst.
Yeah, and finally, the question of indebtedness has been very much debated, and people have been basically saying complete debt relief to the poor countries. But also emerging economies do have quite sizable debt, like even Turkey has 70% GDP in debt. So how do you resolve that nagging sort of debt issue that sort of spreads from the poorest to the...
Yeah, it's a big issue. Of course, in the poorest countries, it's a debilitating issue. And I think the international community now is finally doing more for the poorest country debt. But as you say, it's not just the poorest country. Brazil has a huge debt burden. Of course, Turkey has it, and the other countries, Philippines has it, other Latin American countries have large debt burdens. And some of that debt has been accumulated due to the excessive volatility in international capital markets. You had periods, not now, interest rates are quite low right now, but there were periods where all of a sudden interest rates shot up, not because of anything Mexico did or Turkey did, but because of something the Federal Reserve did, or something that happened in Europe, particularly if we recall the big debt crisis of the early 1980s. So it's a collective problem. It's too easy to say, well, if you've got debt, you must have really misbehaved in the past. Sometimes the misbehavior has been on the part of the lenders who rushed in and then overwhelmed the country with credit, so to speak, and without actually also channeling them to the best sectors, the most productive investments. So the responsibility for debt is shared often, and we must look at the debt problem from that point of view. Of course, international capital markets can bring additional resources, and we should work with them. We should not lock our doors to international flows, not at all. But I think we should manage the debt in a much more proactive way.
What's your recommendation?
Well, the recommendation is that for the poorest countries, there really should be forgiveness on a large scale, particularly because some of these debt also were very political. The odious debt problem. In the old days, when there was still the Cold War, you would give debt to your friends without really looking at how they used it. Did they use it for their own people, or did they divert it into their own pockets, or bought arms with it? So this kind of debt, I think we should create a clean slate. For the other types of debts in the middle income countries, such as Brazil, Turkey, they should be built down over time. And I think the international institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, should accompany this effort by providing longer term funds at lower cost. That's one of the proposals in my book. That
soft loan.
Well, not very soft, not as soft as for Africa or so on, but there should be reasonably low interest rates on long-term resources that can be used for poverty reduction also in these countries. We have to remember that a country like Brazil, for example, has huge numbers of poor people, very, very poor people. And therefore, they should not suffer from the macroeconomic stabilization efforts that are needed. Now, of course, this should be done over a long period. This cannot be solved overnight. There's no magic solution. But if we work on it together, and if we recognize the problem, and don't simply say that it's all the fault of these countries, but if we work internationally in solving this problem, I think we can make progress.
But this also has to come with some conditionality, because
Yes.
otherwise
Yes.
soft loan will disappear.
Yes, I am not against conditionality. I think there have to be governance-related conditionalities, economic and social policy-related conditionalities. For example, if there's going to be a subsidy that benefits to some degree from international support, it should go to the poor people, not to vested interests. That kind of conditionality, I think, is needed. But you see, for conditionality to be accepted, and we come back to the beginning of our chat today, these institutions have to be perceived as truly legitimate, as truly international, and also owned and supported by the developing countries. And so, you see, it's all linked. If you want to have good conditionality, you have to have legitimacy.
But how do you, when you have 7 rich countries basically dictating terms, how do you make them take a little less prominent role and allow other countries to play a role? How do you do that in the Bretton Woods institutions like the fund and the bank?
Well, I think in the end, the world is interdependent. A stronger India, a more rapidly growing Brazil or Turkey, or a better economic situation in Africa helps everyone, including the G7 countries. Crisis, lack of security, failure in governance mechanisms breeds disease, breeds terror, breeds environmental degradation. Increasingly, I think the citizens of the world realize, and the young people more than the others perhaps, realize that their future is interlinked. And therefore, I do believe if you want to have good policies and legitimacy, then the citizens in the richer countries have to agree to share, not give up totally, because they also deserve, influence and certain abilities to influence events, but it has to be shared better. And I think in the enlightened interest of the rich countries themselves indicate that there is need for reform, there is need for sharing, there is need for a more democratic international system. Everybody will benefit from it in the long run. And I think that's the message of a better, globalization.
Thank you very much, Kemal Dervis.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.